Our next speaker is Dr. Richard David Williams, Reader in Music and South Asian Studies at SOAS University of London. He received his PhD from King's College London, and today he'll present his paper titled Mughals Between Maqam and Raga, Paida begs Hindi scholarship under Shah Jahan. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Williams.
So first of all, thank you so much for including me in today's program. I do not work on Timurid musicology, so I've been furiously making notes and learning a lot from all of you, so thank you so much. I'm going to be a bit of an interloper here. I'm talking about Hindi musicology, but very much in the sort of Persianate spirit of things. So not so much Persian, but definitely Persianate. And I'm very grateful to the organizers for putting William's paper immediately before me, because actually this is a duet, really. Our two papers really speak to each other, and now it will make a lot more sense because you've just had 20 minutes of this issue about finding equivalences between Maqam and Rag. So today I'm going to be talking about an unpublished, unedited text that a couple of us, including William, are beginning to think about critically for the first time. So I'm going to introduce the text, and then in the second part, I want to discuss the circulation of this Hindi music treatise, both in terms of manuscripts, but also through courtly paintings from Rajasthan in northern India. And my aim here is to consider how far Persianate music systems were meaningful in northern India in the early modern period, and what this text might have to contribute to our larger discussions about this term Indo-Persian and what that might mean. This study is also reflecting on the cultural history of the relationship between the Mughals and the Rajputs. In the popular imagination, often it's thought that Mughals and Rajputs were in high contrast with one another. Often today in Hindu nationalist narratives, the Mughals are seen as Persianate, non-Indian, and Muslim, while Rajputs are Sanskritic or vernacular and somehow authentically Indian or Deshi and Hindu. And this very simple binary ignores all of the significant entanglements between Mughal and Rajput courts and families. So here I'm thinking in particular about Rajput kings who served as major administrators in the Mughal Empire, Mughal emperors who had Rajput mothers, and the extensive cultural collaborations between these two courtly cultures, especially at the level of literature and music. So in terms of music, over the 17th century, musicians and music scholars circulated between the patronage of Mughal and Rajput nobles, cultivating a form of trans-regional elite art music that was recognized across different courtly spaces. Likewise, a range of scholars and poets, especially those who were writing in classical Hindi or Braj Bhasha, were also moving between courts. So in this context, Alison Bush, who was a scholar of Hindi literature, underlined the forgotten history of these cultural interactions and the significance of Mughal patronage for what is conventionally understood as Rajput or Hindi. So I'm trying to sort of follow in her steps and trying to make sense of a particular text. So today I'm going to look at this one music treatise in terms of the author's arguments and then also its reception history. I suggest that these need to be understood separately. So basically the intellectual I'm going to introduce had a very strong agenda, I'd say, in his music treatise, and he really wanted to reflect on what it means to bring Persianate and Indian music together, much in the spirit of William's paper. But in the reception history, that whole agenda really falls out of the manuscript transmission quite dramatically. So this is why I'm considering them separately. So let's jump in. So this is a Hindi music treatise, the Sabha Vinoda, or the Delight of the Court, written by Paida Beg. It was written for Shah Jahan, at a moment when the Mughals were especially interested in vernacular discussions on musical aesthetics. At that time, the court attracted both Muslim Kalawant musicians, most notably Kushal Khan Gunasamudra, and also Brahmin intellectuals. It was a really interesting time. And so I'm looking at this treatise as part of a constellation of music treatises that were being produced in Shah Jahan's court in old forms of Hindi. There's another treatise, which I won't talk about today, that was written by a woman, Jana Begum, who I believe was the poet Statman Rahim's daughter, and a very unusual text also written in Hindi. So really this treatise is coming out at a particular moment of time where there's a whole group of intellectuals trying to read across Persian and Sanskrit and produce new musical works in Hindi. Paida Beg himself was situated firmly in the world of Mughal service. He provides a very brief account of his own family, talking about his father and grandfather who had been in Akbar's service. And then he introduces Shah Jahan following the emperor's preferred millenarian imagery. He calls him Shah of Shahs, the mighty lord, second lord of the auspicious conjunction, the emperor Shah Jahan. And so I realize most people here probably can't read Devanagari, which wasn't very helpful of me. But so the English here is Shah Jahan is a jewel of a Shah among the Shahs, the giver of justice, shelter to the wretched, whose name is beloved to the world. To touch his feet is a life fulfilled. The cow and the lion lie down together in affection. Every heart yearns to behold his feet. On the basis of justice, Shah Jahan has made his people prosper. He is the breaker of grief, destroyer of his enemies, the form of magnificent taste. I'll just read the last line in Hindi because a lot of you will be able to understand half of it probably. Sahi Jahan jo adil bala parja kari nihala dukh banjana ganjana arini murti maharasal. So throughout his text, he's drawing on a lot of Persian titles and Persian political concepts, but he's rendering them in the vernacular. Here we have this lovely reference to the cow and the lion, which recalls the image of Shah Jahan's throne in the Padshah Nama. His rule is characterized by justice, adil, but in other ways, this is very much a Braj Bhasha Sanskritic poem. A lot of the time, the language used here recalls the types of phrases that you would use to invoke a Hindu deity or a Hindu king. He's talking about delivering one from suffering and crushing his enemies using a very sort of Sanskritic register, Dukha Banjana Ganjana Arini. He also uses the language of rasa theory, which is, again, coming from the sort of canonical Sanskritic aesthetic theory. As Catherine Schofield, who's a major historian of Mughal period music, has shown, Mughal intellectuals were working across Persianate and Sanskritic intellectual systems to cultivate refined sensibilities, aspiring to the status of the rasika, the Sanskrit word for a connoisseur, one who understands and experiences in their body the elevated dimensions of the arts. So with all of this crisscrossing between intellectual systems, cultural terms, aesthetics, we land at this problematic term Indo-Persian. There's, of course, a very large debate around this term and whether it's helpful, so I'm not going to bother going into all of it. But on the one hand, we have the fact that this is a multilingual milieu. So I'm talking about in blue, Paida Beg's Sabha vinoda. So blue here sort of represents old forms of Hindi or Hindavi or Braj Bhasha. He is part of a set of treatises that are drawing on a Sanskrit work, the Sangita Darpana, which itself is also part of a longer transmission. But that transmission goes into Persian texts later on in the 17th century. And as we'll see, Paida Beg's Hindi treatise is then folded into the material of the Tofat al-Hind in the 1670s, which becomes sort of the major go-to reference point for a lot of Persian Mughal musicologists going forward. So he's very much part of this network. So in some ways, it makes sense to talk about this as an Indo-Persian scholar who's moving between languages and cultural systems. So why then might that be a problem? Of course, some historians have argued that this gets us into the language of fusion and syncretism. It suggests that somehow Indo is one block and Persian is another neat block, and then you can combine them together like pieces of Lego, and that's not actually how culture works. In musicology, we've got a number of possible scenarios. So William in particular, as you just heard, is building up the language of finding equivalences and thinking about transcultural translation. Catherine Schofield in the past has talked about appropriation of different musical models coming from Persian in order to help one understand Indian instruments, Indian performance practices. But I think in this case, with Paida Beg, actually the term Indo-Persian works perfectly well. And I think his own agenda is to try and pool these two cultures together as previously separate elements into one new hybrid. So why do I say that? Well, he describes his own work as a digest of ideas he's encountered from 1,000 works. And he tries to reconcile approaches to Rag, which he's read about in Hindavi, and Maqam. So he calls this a combination of Hindavi and Persian. And so he says here, I speak of the visualization of Rag, taking from 1,000 works, combining them in the vernacular so the learned man might understand. The knowledge of sound is extremely complicated, so many mysteries therein. Paida Beg discusses music, reflecting on it through the Hanuman system. So this is a Sanskrit musicological term for thinking about rag classification. It's called the Hanuman system, and he's read about it in a Sanskrit music treatise, and so he's using that as his overall template. But he says, I collected together rags, those born in Hindavi and Persian. The veena, the instrument, draws out all those that are combined therein. In my mind, I have thought of it like combining in a sun all the complex forms of sound, so unfathomable and impenetrable. So he's explicitly using the language of the two parents, the Hindi and the Persian, coming together and creating a child. And of course, he is writing this for Shah Jahan, who has a Rajput mother. So I think he is sort of blending together the idea of dynastic collaboration between Mughals and Rajputs, between Hindavi and Sanskrit, and giving it a musical body. So he's talking about visualization here. So just to explain that, a large part of this treatise is drawing on the Sanskrit music treatises before him in order to visualize rags. So the art historians in the room will be familiar with ragamala, the practice of visualizing a rag through a codified iconography. So a rag is expressed in these treatises not only in terms of its musical features and the arrangement of the scale, but also in terms of its poetic and aesthetic qualities, including its gender, its time of day, its association with seasons, but also a very clear visual. So Rag Deepak, for example, in some systems would be a red king ablaze riding on an elephant on a very hot day. Right, and so then you can describe it through poetry, and you can also depict it in painting. So this was very fashionable in the early 17th century, and so a lot of Paida Beg's treatise is really about that. But he's also constantly referring back to the older tradition of Persianate musical thought. William Hoffman has a lovely article about how the Mughals in this period started to get really fascinated by the historical memory of Emir Khusro, and we can see that in this text. So he says, sages consider these 12 maqams. Emir Khusro has said as much. They sing his praises everywhere. Debating how to translate these, but what cannot be said remains in silence. I have combined them, the maqams, with rags, and have reflected upon them all as one system of music. So again, he's doing very much what we've just heard about in the previous paper. He's setting up equivalences. And so he has one section of the treatise where he sets up maqams and then says, well, the equivalent would be this and this in the rag system. And like I say, when we think about transmission, he is also part of the Persianate universe in the sense that later intellectuals like Mirza Khan draw on his work and include it in their own canonical texts. But although he has this clear ideology and he wants to bring together these systems in a single body as though it were a child, what's very interesting is a lot of later readers of his work were not interested in this Indo-Persian idea at all. And a lot of readers didn't really want to engage with what he had to say about maqam. They just didn't find it interesting. They were much more interested in what he was doing with the visualizations and the ragamala type iconographies of rags. So I'm just going to move into the reception mode. So it's interesting that on the one hand, this is a text that hasn't really been studied before. It wasn't really identified, but art historians knew about it. They just didn't realize it was Paida Beg and his treatise coming from Shah Jahan. Klaus Eberling, who wrote the ultimate guide to ragamala painting, identified this treatise as text I, but he thought that it was coming from Rajasthan. And the reason he thought that was because it is widely reproduced on paintings known as the Amber tradition. So these are 4 ragamala sets coming from Amber, i.e. from around Jaipur, and the inscriptions above each image are taken directly from Paida Beg's treatise. And so, of course, that's completely typical with ragamala painting. Usually the verses are coming from a larger, hefty music treatise, but the artist's workshop have ignored all of the boring technical musicological material, taken out the beautiful poetry and inscribed them on the paintings. Because it's so iconically the Amber tradition, it was assumed that this text was a Rajput text coming out of Rajasthan by probably a Rajput poet, but actually it's coming from Shah Jahan's court. It's most likely that this text moved across into Rajasthan into the court of Mirza Raja Jai Singh I, who was very much working alongside the Mughal court in this period. Just as a quick, I think, fun aside, sorry, you'll notice that in this particular depiction, sometimes the clothes are yellow, sometimes the clothes are gray of the central figure, the figure of the Rag himself. And again, I think that's as simple as one letter being different in the inscription. So in some of the folios, you have Syama Badana Pita Vapumanon with a dusk dark face and a yellow body. So then you get the yellow garment with the dusky face. And then some of the scribes changed the da to a sa. So it becomes Syama Basana Pita Vapumanon with dark clothing and a yellow body. And so suddenly the colors all switch over. Not particularly relevant to my argument, but I thought it was fun. Now, one of the things that gets very interesting is how this text travels and how scribes start editing it and cutting things. So, like I say, we don't have a critical edition of this text. So I've been working with 4 known copies. So the oldest I have is 1689, and that's from Jaipur, and that's, of course, where all of these ragamala paintings are being produced. There's another one from Jodhpur, 1825, another 19th century one from somewhere in North India. It's in a private collection, and I'm not quite clear on the provenance. And one that is undated but ended up in Nepal and has been preserved as part of the big manuscript preservation project that they had in Kathmandu. So again, that's quite interesting. The fact that this treatise came out of Shah Jahan's court, did really well in Rajasthan, and made it to Nepal. When you look at what these different copies include or exclude, it's very interesting. So the Jaipur and Jodhpur ones include all of the section about Shah Jahan, and they include Paida Beg talking about his family. So when you read those two texts, this is very much a Mughal text coming out of the center of Shah Jahan's court. When you get to the purple and green manuscripts, that's gone. Whoever's writing it thought, nope, we don't need the Mughals here anymore. There's also this whole section about maqam at the end of the work. So you see the 12 maqam right at the bottom, the idea of mixing Hindi and Persian, creating a son who is, a music system that is both. A second section on maqam, that's also only there in the first two manuscripts. So these later manuscripts have again cut out all of the references to Persian music. Was it because they didn't like the Mughals, or was it because they were musicians who didn't know anything about maqam and were very much rag-based musicians and thought, this is irrelevant to us? What's interesting is the Nepal manuscript has some material that isn't there in the other texts, including some quite technical sort of scale-based discussions of rags as well. So if one were keen enough to create a critical edition of this, it would be quite interesting to actually think through what kinds of musicological information were considered relevant or interesting in these different settings. So in kind of summary, looking at the scribal transmission of this work underlines how the musical knowledge recorded in treatises was very malleable, and it could be repurposed for different readers with apparently varied interests. And the diversity within the tradition of a single text, from painted poems to mapping the affinities between maqam and rag, suggests that the people who copied and studied these treatises didn't have a shared sense of a homogeneous and monolithic Indo-Persian musical system, but instead they brought their own priorities and curiosities to bear on their work in music. It seems that Paida Beg's treatise was mostly read as an anthology of Ragamala visualizations. And certainly that was how it was used in the Rajput ateliers at Amber and Jaipur. The reception history of the text highlights the elasticity of the music treatise as a genre. Verses are extracted. There's an entire section on rhythm that sort of comes and goes across the different editions. There are very technical materials relating to scales and the tats that again only appears in one version. So these variations in the form and content of the treatise indicate how different users deployed the treatise as a reference work. Although Paida Beg probably saw his integration of maqam and his thoughts on the synergies between maqam and rag as his main contribution, in fact, these could easily be cut out and jettisoned, along with his explicit anchoring of his work in the political imaginary of Shah Jahan. So in many ways, the case of Paida Beg recalls what the literature historian Alison Bush termed poets hidden in plain sight. So there she was talking about Hindi poets who were hidden in plain sight in the Mughal court. Likewise, the Sabha vinoda was known to music scholars primarily because it was invoked in the Persian Tofat al-Hind, and it was also known to art historians because it was so important in Rajput painting coming out of Amber. But in fact, the actual text was hidden somewhere between these 2 points, the one Persian musical, the other Rajput and visual. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful I was just wondering if you this in the account of Maqam and this treatise that other Persian sources suggest something about that.
Yeah, so I haven't, but William has. So we're debating at the moment whether we should keep these as separate papers or actually merge them together. And yes, I mean, I don't want to put him on the spot because it's still a work in progress. But yeah, you think that I am going to put you on the spot. Yeah, what's your take on this?
I mean,
the section on the movements in the Sabha follows very closely.
This also happens with Japan.
Yeah. So I mean, if
he just adopted, the material from Bulgarian and he just copied.
Yeah.
But I mean, I guess it could be taken from the Sabha. Yes, if the Zanzibar is the source for Sabha.
Exactly.
And but he mentions the Bulgarian when he mentions.
Exactly, he does. Yeah. So it could be Zamzama to Sabha to Tophet. Yeah.
How about the account of Indian music? Do they draw on Sangeeta Ratnakara?
He's mostly drawing on the Sangeeta Darpana, which itself was, let's go back to here. So the Sangeeta Darpana was a sort of digest of other materials in Sanskrit music treatises, including Sangeeta Ratnakara, but not only. And again, that text is around 1600. It also gets put into Braj Bhasha, the Hari Vallabha translation. So it could be Paida Beg was actually using Hari Vallabha and not reading the Sanskrit original. We don't know. They don't usually clarify when they're using the Hindi version or the Sanskrit. But yeah, so he would have gone to Sangeeta Darpana rather than back to the Sangeeta Ratnakara. Yeah.
Very much. I'm thinking of the text of the very interesting way between Mughals devise the text. And of the four manuscripts we mentioned, so the first one is 1689. So what's happening between 1689 and 1825? Is there a gap because lack of sources or there?
Yeah. So yes, the red and blue ones are very similar, as you can see in the structure. So it could well be that they are in the same set of the transmission. It's hard to know if there were other treatises circulating between that time. I mean, there were other music treatises in Rajasthan that were popping up in the interval. And so some of them are copied quite widely and become the sort of standard reference points for other scholars in Rajasthan. So it's hard to say. It's hard to say whether this Jodhpur one is a copy of the Jaipur one, whether there are lots of other copies, but we just don't know about them. 1689 is also, later than when it first appears in paintings in Jaipur. So there would have been another copy in the court at some stage as well. So yes, the search continues for more manuscripts, basically. Yeah. Yes, thank you. Yeah. Sorry, can you say again?
The schools of musicians.
Yeah. You don't really see references to the term Gharana until relatively late. It's only really, we've only really seen it being used specifically as a Gharana, sort of in 19th century sources. Before that, you do get references to brotherhoods, you get references to lineages of Kalawants, etc. And so that is quite common in Persian music treatises. So in Catherine Schofield's book, she talks about tazkiras of musicians that appear where they do break down the genealogies quite clearly, but not Gharana per se. In this text, you also don't really have a discussion of the named musicians in the Mughal court, but you do get that in other treatises from this context. So I mentioned the treatise written by the woman, Jana Begum, and she has a verse where she does name a set of the leading Mughal musicians. for example, which we can find in other Persian texts from the same period. But in this one, he doesn't name musicians, unfortunately. Okay, thank you.